What is up, 20 plus? Welcome back to week number 2 of life groups on our series about doubt, comparison, insecurity. I'm so excited that you're back, and hopefully you enjoyed last week where we talked about doubt. If you missed it, head to YouTube, find it. It's gonna be absolutely amazing. We will have the link for you out on social. It's gonna be absolutely awesome. But thanks so much for joining us again for week number 2. It's gonna be great. Today, we get to talk about the topic of comparison. And I know comparison is something that we talk about a lot. A lot of times we talk about it when we think about social media, when we think about maybe other people who we feel are maybe further along than us, but we all do it. We all compare. The Bible talks a lot about comparison, and I want us to read it in Matthew chapter 13. It's an amazing verse, and maybe you didn't read it when you were thinking about comparison, but I'm gonna ask that you look through it from maybe a different lens, and I think you're gonna get something out, because I know when I read it, I was blown away. But it's in Matthew chapter 13, and it's the parable of the sower. Maybe you've read it before, but I'm starting in verse 1. It says, that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still, other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop 160 or 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. And when we read this verse, we think, okay, that's awesome, and God's telling us maybe to stay away from these things and to focus on these things. But I think a lot of times we can become victim of all of these traps in the way that we look at others. Let's start by looking at the first one that Jesus talks about, and that's in verse 4. It's the birds. And the birds, I think, have a different name maybe in 2019, and that would be haters. The birds are the haters, because you put out your seed, you put out the stuff that you think maybe you've been dreaming about doing something, and maybe it's music, or maybe it's a passion of yours, or maybe it's a photo, or whatever it is that you're passionate about. You put it out there, and immediately there are haters that are gonna come, and they're gonna steal your seed, they're gonna steal the things that you put out, and they're gonna steal your joy. And immediately from believing and hoping that you were gonna do something great, all of a sudden these haters come and they are birds. And for me, I kind of have a little bit of a fear of those little birds that swoop down at you. Whenever I would be like mowing the lawn, they swoop down, I would kind of like flinch. And so even talking about them, I have a very direct relationship with haters and birds. That was a personal thing that I just wanted to throw in there. But with those haters, it's so easy to just let them come and let them steal your joy. It's so easy to just let them come and let them ruin what God's put in your life. And what Jesus is saying is don't be like that. You've got to protect, you've got to put your seeds deep down, and we'll get to that in a minute, but don't just leave your seeds at the top. Don't, the Bible says don't cast your pearls to pigs. Don't just give it out to everybody. Make sure that you're really sowing, you're really paying attention to where you're putting things, not just putting it out there just for people to see. And maybe you're not ready. Maybe the thing that you've been creating, or the step that you've been wanting to take, maybe you're not quite ready to get there yet. And that leads us to verse number 5, which is the rocky soil. And this is where we start looking at other people and saying, how come they're growing so fast? How come they got so many followers? How come what they're doing is so great? How come they got the job that paid so well? How come their grades are so good? How come they got that girl or that guy that's so much better looking than me, or so much better looking than all these other people, and that's so amazing for them? And all of a sudden they start sprouting really quickly, and you feel like you're back there in the dust, and you're like, God, why is nothing growing in my life? I see all these things growing. I see all these people on social media. I see all these people with perfect lives, and I'm here and nothing's happening. And God's saying that's because it's built on just rocky soil. It's not very deep, and so it's gonna sprout really quickly, but there's no depth. And so when a storm comes, or when rain comes, or when somebody comes to pick it out, it's so easy to just pick that out. And so the relationships don't last, maybe their job doesn't last, maybe their passion project or whatever it is, it's gonna fizzle out because they didn't build it in a solid place. They just put it in soil that wasn't very deep. And I remember when I was in Israel and we were looking at this, and obviously the Bible, most of it was written in that area of the world. And we were going through and we were seeing these farmers, and the farmers' fields had rocks all on the side. There were big, giant piles of rocks. And I asked one of the guides a question. I said, why are there so many big piles of rocks? He said, well, in Israel, there's rocks everywhere. And so if you are gonna farm, you've gotta first pick out all of the rocks out of your field in order to plant, because otherwise the soil's not gonna be ready. And so it made this verse make so much more sense, because sometimes we think, oh, it's these little tiny rocks. These were boulders. These were big rocks that were in the way, that were making farming so difficult. And so sometimes it's not just these little tiny pebbles, it's these big things in the way, but we feel like, no, it's all good. I don't need to worry about that. I don't need to focus on those issues in my life, because I'm gonna plant something and I wanna grow it and I want it to become really big, really fast, because that's how it is. It's an overnight success, and I wanna do that because that's what all my friends are doing. And God's saying that's the wrong thing to do. It's gonna sprout real quickly, but it's not gonna last. And then we see the third one. And the third one is the thorns, or the weeds, or the things that are growing and taking its place. And a lot of times I've heard people talk about how this represents maybe the things in your life that are holding you back, the thorns in your life, maybe the temptations or the sin in your life that's holding you back to where you plant it, but there's so many other things that are in the way. You say, God, I'm gonna be on fire for you. I'm gonna read my Bible. I'm gonna go to church. I'm gonna do this. But then none of the other things in your life change. You're just living the same life, and maybe you're still doing the party thing, or you're still hanging out with the wrong crowd, or you're still, watching the things that you shouldn't be watching. And God's saying you can't grow something when you don't first get away from the weeds, and first get away from the thorns and start picking them out from your life. And obviously the last one is the good one, where it's putting it on soil that is meant to grow and meant to harvest, where we're picking the rocks out of the way, where we're picking the weeds out of the way. And I thought about this, because the rocks are the long part. A lot of people don't want to take the time to pick the rocks out of the field because it's heavy, because it's long, because it's hard, it's backbreaking work, and it's no fun, and there's no success. Because I know for me, when I think of a new idea, I'm like, I want to go out and do it. I want to go and I want to plant that seed. I don't want to pick rocks because it's not getting me to where I want to go. I want to plant it. I want to grow it. I want to water it. I want to see it flourish. And God's saying, no, first you got to pick the rocks. And you're going, God, I don't want to pick the rocks. I want to plant the seed. And God's saying, no, but first, before you plant the seed, you got to pick the rocks, because otherwise it's not going to last. So the long part of your journey, maybe you feel like you're picking rocks. Maybe you feel like it's over and over again. You're saying, God, I'm not getting any breakthroughs. I'm not getting any growth. I haven't even planted the seed yet. I've been in different jobs. I've transferred schools. I've been in all these relationships, God, and I don't know. I can't even plant anywhere. And God's saying, you're just preparing the field, because once something's ready, then you're gonna plant it, then it's gonna grow and last, but you're picking rocks. And that's the first heavy part. But once you do it, picking rocks later is so much easier, because you've got most of them out of the way. But the weeds and the thorns, that represents our daily walk with God. That represents our daily battle with comparing ourselves to others, and say, I can't compare myself to them on the daily. I can't focus on all the other things that they're doing. I gotta focus on the areas in my life that I need to fix. I gotta focus on my devotional life. I gotta focus on my relationships, be more encouraging to others. I'd focus on the things that I can control. Because if we're not careful, then all of a sudden we picked all the rocks, we made all of it happen, but then we don't make the weeds get out of our life. We don't pick the weeds in our life. And all we do is we focus on what they were doing. All of a sudden the weeds come, the rocks come back, and before we know it, we get back to where we started, and all that hard work goes away. So I just encourage you to talk in your groups and say, what can I do? What are things maybe that I need to take responsibility of, and how can I avoid comparing myself to others, avoiding comparing myself to my competitors, to people who I wish I could be, or people who I wish I wasn't. And I think that we're gonna get a lot out of this, and I hope that your discussions are great, and we'll see you back next week.